Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Scope here on British Muslim TV. We're happy to be coming to you once again this week with me, Waqar Rizvi, your host. We're going to be discussing Islamophobia in Canada. And of course, just to let you know, we are being broadcast live wherever British Muslim TV is broadcast live on satellite, as well as, of course, via BMTV's various social media channels, be it Facebook, Twitter, or otherwise. And of course, we would really appreciate your comments to the numbers at the bottom of the screen. Please do send your comments or even if you have questions, and even during the show, yes, if you want to put them to any of our panelists throughout the live show. Now, as I said, we are going to be discussing Islamophobia in Canada, and at a very specific anniversary on June 6th, 2021, which is just last year, a Muslim family in London, Ontario, Canada, was purposefully run over in an Islamophobic terror attack. Now, while that was not the first such terror attack, unfortunately, especially keeping in mind, of course, the Quebec mosque terror attack, the killing of the Afzal family sent shockwaves across the nation. Now, while Canadian politicians, including the Prime Minister, have condemned Islamophobia, one wonders what's really changed on the ground and what more needs to be done. In Quebec, for example, the province of Quebec, I should say, Bill 21 targets Muslims, especially women who wear the hijab, as well as other minorities, such as Sikhs who wear the turban, under the guise of religious neutrality. And that, of course, continues to affect not just the Muslim community, but other minority communities in that province as well. Let's discuss all of these issues, as well as others, with our esteemed panelists who are joining us live today. We're joined by Dr. Jasmin Zine, who is a professor of sociology and the Muslim studies option at Wilfrid Laurier University. And we're also joined by Zhou, who is an award-winning journalist, writer, and producer. Jasmin and Stephen, assalamu alaikum to you both, and thank you both for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us today on BMTV. Jasmin, I'd like to start with you, if I may. And I wanted to get your thoughts on how you reflect on this anniversary of the killing of the Afzal family.
Well, thank you for the question and for having me on the program to discuss Islamophobia in Canada, and especially around this very tragic point where we're at 1 year after the terrible death of the Afzal family, who were, a year ago in the midst of the pandemic, went out for an evening stroll in their neighborhood and were intentionally mowed down by a truck that killed 4 members of that family. And 3 generations of that family in that terrorist attack, which we now know was at the hands of a white nationalist, similar to the attack in 2017 in the mosque in Quebec, in Sainte-Foy, which took the lives of 6 Muslim men after their evening prayers, also at the hands of a white nationalist. And so Canada has a reckoning with a number of issues that underlie and underpin Islamophobia in this country. And so I think these times of collective memorialization of the victims of these tragic acts has to happen in tandem with a recognition of the fact that Islamophobia has reached deadly proportions in this country, and that there needs to be measures in place to ensure that this tragedy, doesn't repeat itself or happen again. And so we need to address those root causes of Islamophobia in this country to prevent future tragedies, but also I think it's incumbent in honoring the memories of those who have been lost, that their deaths are not forgotten, and that people are acting to ensure that this kind of tragedy is avoided in the future.
Stephen, probably the government would say, listen, we've done a lot. We've had the summit on Islamophobia. We've even spoken about a national day of Islamophobia. What more should and can the government do you think?
The steps taken so far commenced after the tragedies had happened. Once you get to that point, it's already too late. Obviously, Canada is a G7 leader within the past 5 years when it comes to Islamophobia-related deaths. There have been movement. That's because, again, the PR is so bad for some of these leaders. If they don't comply and start meeting with community members, with various advocacy organizations across the country, it's just not going to cut it with, it just doesn't, won't fly really. So right now there's finally legislation being proposed, for example, to hold spy agencies and personnel associated with those domestic and international spy agencies within Canada, national security agencies accountable if they lie in court, for example. These are agencies that have been in a lot of hot water in the past 20 years or so, particularly with respect to their work in the Muslim communities. The Border Security Agency is, we're starting to see some movement on oversight, what that looks like, whether it has teeth. We don't know yet. That has to be fleshed out. And there are other things, but these are the beginnings. We don't know yet, and you have to keep the foot on the pedal, so to speak, because politicians, these lawmakers will move if we move.
Jasmin, what do you make of the stances made so far by politicians, as well as even what Stephen there mentioned, the fact that what we are waiting to see to come, so for example, the Canadians have said that they will now appoint somebody to essentially fight Islamophobia, right? A rapporteur of sorts, if I may use that term. Is that enough? What kind of policy changes do we need?
Well, I think, last year, of course, as you mentioned, the Islamophobia Summit took place, which was supposed to be an attempt to begin to, reach out to Muslim community and experts and to inform the government about how to address Islamophobia. But unfortunately, that summit, really didn't have the right people at the table to be able to do that work of informing policy. There were lots of folks that were not at the table that should have been. And, a number of recommendations, I think hundreds, were put forward by Muslim community members, various groups. We have no indication as to what might have been actionable from those recommendations that the government is taking on board. And so there really hasn't been any feedback, so what we do see the government doing are holding these, summits, various parliamentary hearings. I was just invited to one later this month, a Senate parliamentary, or a Senate committee rather, looking at Islamophobia. I've been to many of these gatherings, sat at these tables in the past, and have not really seen, what concrete action emerges from them. And I think, in fact, if we look back to Motion 103, which was put forward in the aftermath of the Quebec mosque shooting, and there was a huge amount of backlash against that motion, which was really about addressing Islamophobia in this country, naming it, and putting into place measures to combat it. There was a report that emerged from that after several, hearings. I think there were 600 people involved in these hearings from various groups, and yet Islamophobia in the final report, which had to do with systemic discrimination, was very much sidelined. So I don't think that we're seeing the commitment that we need to see.
Stephen, and I'm glad Jasmin brought up 103, because that goes to show, does it not, Stephen, to an extent, the kind of resistance that exists on the part of then politicians to actually make those genuine changes that are needed, where there's always that argument, and I know it's not the only argument, but one of the arguments is that Muslims just want special treatment, that they're against free speech, etc. What do you make of that?
That motion back in 2017 or so, that was a sign that our elected officials, primarily from the Conservative Party, that their focus had become much more populist, much more willing to kind of include discriminatory ideas, sentiments as their base for operations and that kind of thing. And that was going to be the way they portrayed themselves going forward. You saw some of that kind of like reach a kind of a boiling point with the truckers movement earlier this year. So that's very unfortunate. As a community, we have to hold their feet to the fire. Again, there are systemic things that need to be looked at. Certainly the security agencies have I mean, after 9/11, I mean, we're really living in the aftermath of how Muslims have been portrayed and treated by the federal government and by the media and so forth. Security agencies, for example, the Revenue Agency in Canada has been targeting charities and targeting Muslim charities. There have been reports about disproportionate targeting of Muslim charities. And the CBSA, which is the Border Security Agency, all these federal sort of systems that really play a huge role in everybody's life has done damage to Muslim communities across the country. And these systemic things have been a kind of focal point in recommendations, for example. And there's been some movement on it. Again, it took a lot, took too much to have to start moving on these things, but they're happening, and we'll see what happens.
Jasmin, before we go into the break, I wanted to ask you about, in fact, the complex issues on the table here, right? Because the attacks in and of themselves, of course, are gruesome. Everyone, as I said, has condemned them, but they're not the entire picture, right? There's a lot happening behind the scenes, which has led up to these attacks and the aftermath which continues. What are your thoughts about how complex that is and how tough this is genuinely to then tackle?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I think that, there's a lot of ingredients that went into the lead up to attacks like what we've seen in Canada, which speak to the homegrown nature of Islamophobia in this country, which is very deeply rooted. I think, the contemporary iteration of that would be most prominent after 9/11 and its aftermath. And we've, looked at a number of policy issues that we've been discussing here so far. In addition to that, though, there's also public sentiment, which over the last 2 decades, has also been quite, problematic in terms of looking at the Muslim presence in Canada. So, for example, my research team looked at, the polls in Canada over the last 2 decades, and we found that, for example, after the attacks in 2017, there was a similar support, about 23% in Canada.
Okay, Jasmin, I'm going to cut you off. I do sincerely apologize. We have to go into a break, but I will allow you to continue this right after this break. Please do stay with us, viewers. We'll be back with Jasmin and Stephen right after this. Please stay tuned for that. Welcome back, everyone, to The Scope here on BMTV with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're still joined by Jasmin and Stephen. We continue to discuss the issue of Islamophobia in Canada. And Jasmin, before we went to the break, you were discussing about the policies as well as the many complex issues around the issue of Islamophobia beyond just attacks that we may see, physical attacks that we may see. But I also wanted to put this question to you, Jasmin, if I may, as a Canadian myself, growing up in quote unquote what we were always told was a multicultural society, and certainly it is and was. I wonder, why would we see this sort of white supremacy and white nationalism even within a society where you have so much people-to-people contact, even in large urban centers such as Toronto or Montreal or other such larger cities? So why even there would you see any of this sort of hate? Because we've always been told, haven't we, that people-to-people contact is the best solution.
Right. I mean, I think, one of the things that we need to grapple with in Canada is looking at what I call liberal Islamophobia. And what I mean by that is the fact that there is that paradox based on the idea that, we have this sort of multicultural society where there's celebrations, there's sort of an Islamic History Month, and Muslims as ethno-racial groups are celebrated within the nation. But on the other hand, we have policies and practices in place that are, putting Muslims under scrutiny, as we've discussed already. Things like Bill 21, the no-fly list, the Passenger Protect Program, the targeting of Muslims by security agencies, and so on. So we have these two kinds of paradoxical, features within Canada, where Muslims are celebrated on the one hand and disavowed on the other. This Islamophilia meets Islamophobia. And so I think that for too long, multiculturalism has been a smokescreen behind which a great deal of inequality and racism that is deeply rooted in this country has been obscured. And what we're starting to now see are where those tensions and deeply embedded systems are surfacing, so that we can see how they are operating to promote Islamophobia as a system of oppression, in this country.
Stephen, during my time in Canada too, and it seems a lot of the times when we talk about Islamophobia as well as any form of racism, for a while, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, certainly, the conversation would sometimes revolve just around Quebec, right? Where it'd be, oh, these sorts of things happen in Quebec. And we've had Bill 21, as of course, Jasmin mentioned as well. And that is a bill which essentially targets any outward appearance of religious symbols, just for the sake of our viewers to know. I'm paraphrasing it, certainly. But I wonder, what are your thoughts on that? Is that also a dangerous generalization where we just put it on Quebec, and I guess then the narrative is the rest of Canada is fine?
Canada had hundreds of years of slavery, not identical to the systems they had in the American South, but that's part of our past. We don't talk about it very much. It's not taught in our high schools. We have, to this day, are unearthing corpses of young children, their skeletons, across the country from residential schools of that essentially took the children of Indigenous families and put them in these schools, and many of them were abused, malnourished, and died in the hundreds. We're still unearthing their bodies. You can't the kind of patting, Canadians patting themselves on the back with regards to multiculturalism is really the flip side of a kind of neoliberal, everybody's the same, everybody is an individual, equal consumer in a new society, that kind of ethic that is being discredited across the world. Certainly it is not just Quebec. Here in Canada, Bill 21 is bad. There needs to be movement on it. It's going to go to the Supreme Court probably as a constitutional challenge. But just in the past Ramadan, for example, a few weeks ago, advocacy organizations in Canada have received calls, probably one or two every day, about some kind of Islamophobic incident that we just don't put on the news. It would completely flood everything. And these are organizations that are completely understaffed, can only employ maybe half a dozen lawyers to deal with everything across Canada. So Edmonton, there's been anti-Muslim, anti-Black Muslim women who are visibly Muslim being attacked in their cars in various parts of BC. I mean, I can go on and on. It's not just the Quebec issue.
Indeed. Jasmin, that leads me to my next question about intersectionality then, right? When it comes to understanding this sort of prejudice, bias, hate towards a group, right? So we're discussing certainly Muslims at this point, but do you think it's also really important to see those connections of hate that runs and prejudice that runs, for example, against the Aboriginal population, as well as towards Muslims and then other minorities, be they not Muslims, the Sikhs, for example, and others?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, there are interlocking forms of oppression, right? And if we want to be able to challenge one, we need to be able to dismantle the broader systems. And so there is, a connection, if we look at, for example, anti-Black racism, and we see the tragedy that happened, in the shooting in Buffalo a couple of weeks ago, which targeted Black Americans. And we look at the way that the shooter that was responsible was inspired by the shooter in Christchurch, New Zealand, at the mosques there, who had the name of the Quebec mosque shooter on his gun, right? We see that there are transnational links in how many of the Islamophobic ideologies are inspiring various hate crimes against different groups. And so we need to be concerned about that. We need to be addressing oppressions in multiple forms so that there is solidarities and alliances as well between groups that are, facing this kind of oppression. So we build those solidarities and alliances there. and be able to look at some of the similarities between particularly how racism is being manifested against different kinds of groups in Canada, whether it's with Aboriginal communities, Black communities, Asian communities during the pandemic. There's many interrelated and intersecting ways that racism and other forms of oppression come together, including looking at how they're gendered and how, for example, Muslim women are differentially affected, or, Islamophobia is lived through different kinds of registers. So, how are Black Muslims experiencing Islamophobia, for example, in different ways? Anti-brown racism, also anti-Arab racism. So it's a complex kind of examination that we need to have.
Stephen, if you're still with us, I wanted to ask you, in fact, about some of the things that Jasmin there mentioned before I got cut off. And that was about, again, as I put to her, intersectionality, but then also the realization that there are lines that connect all of the above forms of racism, right? That's really, really important. I wonder, how does one then deal with that? I mean, do we then realize that as a national security issue, that this should be tackled in the same way, for example, that many of these Western countries tackled Muslims after 9/11 and generalize and prejudice? And I'm not saying we should prejudice or generalize anybody. I'm certainly not saying that what was done was right, but I'm saying, should we expect that sort of hard-handedness when it comes to this?
Well, these ideologies don't respect borders, as was just mentioned. What happens across the country, across various countries, are reflected. How do you stop it? Well, I think first and foremost, you have to realize that the way these things kind of happen is primarily online, that these kinds of radicalization happen online. So you have to have some kind of conversation, at least at the federal level, about how to regulate these spaces. That's finally starting to happen a bit. Ottawa and the Liberal Party, they've convened various consultations with communities that often do include a lot of those post 9/11 problematic language that a lot of community members, a lot of leaders have pushed back against. So there's a back and forth about that. So that has to happen. Again, there's also, let's not forget, the post 9/11 institutional, systemic, legislatively protected systems like the Revenue Agency, like the security agencies, like the border agency. Those practices, just because we're talking about white supremacy and such, yeah, those things have to be, of course, addressed. But the other institutional, systemic forms of Islamophobia from those agencies, they're finally being interrogated, and reforms are being put forth in piecemeal fashion. We would hope that they're starting faster, but the real tragedy is that it took so many deaths, so many incidents for this to become a real item in terms of electoral politics.
Yeah. All right. Well, we just have 90 seconds left, so I'm not going to bring you back in, Jasmin. I do apologize, but we really, really appreciate both Jasmin Zine and Stephen Zhou for taking their time out, as I said, of their very busy schedules. I know that both of you have a lot on your plate, but we really appreciate the insight you brought to the discussion. I know this is just very preliminary discussions, and we'd love to have you back on, of course, to understand even more in depth about Islamophobia, as well as I said, the intersectional issues within the country as well. So viewers, as we were discussing there, we discussed the June 6th terror attack that happened last year on that Afzal family in London, Ontario, Canada, who were purposefully run over by a truck in an Islamophobic terror attack. And a lot of the inspirations link right across the borders, as Stephen and Jasmin both mentioned. So we've had connections with the Christchurch terrorists as well, with many of the attacks that have happened, even in the United States as well, even in Buffalo, as Jasmin had mentioned just a few moments ago. So with Bill 21 still existing, as well as other such measures in place, is it enough to just say that we will now have somebody who will be dealing with Islamophobia on an official level? Is that just rhetoric for the sake of it? We will, of course, keep a very close eye on that here on BMTV and The Scope. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Waqar Rizvi, and of course, please do join us next week for another episode of The Scope right here with me.